In 1517, a German monk nailed 95 theses to a church door and accidentally split Christianity into two branches that still don't fully trust each other over 500 years later. But here's what most people don't realize: it's not really about theological differences anymore. Today, Catholics and Protestants live in the same neighborhoods, marry each other, and often share more in common with each other than with other members of their own faith. Yet the suspicion remains. Why? In this video, we're going to explore the real history behind one of Christianity's deepest divides, why the tension never fully went away, and whether it's finally healing or if it's actually getting worse. To understand why Catholics and Protestants still don't fully trust each other, we need to go back to the beginning. And I mean the real beginning, not just 1517. Medieval Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church. And I mean dominated. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was one of the most powerful political figures on the continent. The Church owned about 30% of the land in Western Europe. It had its own armies, crowned kings and deposed them, collected taxes from ordinary people. When the Pope excommunicated someone, they were literally cast out of society. They couldn't be buried in holy ground, couldn't receive last rites, couldn't be married in the church. For a medieval person, excommunication was social and spiritual death. The Church's power came from a monopoly on salvation. The Catholic doctrine was clear. If you wanted to get to heaven, you had to go through the Church. You needed priests to administer sacraments. You needed the Church's rituals and authority. The Church literally held the keys to heaven. This created an enormous opportunity for corruption, and the Church took full advantage of it. By the 1400s and 1500s, the corruption was staggering. Popes had illegitimate children they'd install in positions of power. Church officials sold indulgences, basically pieces of paper that promised forgiveness of sins for anyone who paid money. A wealthy person could literally buy their way into heaven. An ordinary peasant couldn't afford the price of forgiveness. Bishops and cardinals lived in luxury while claiming to follow Jesus, who explicitly taught his disciples to renounce wealth. There was a massive disconnect between what the Church preached and how it actually operated. Meanwhile, something new was happening in Europe. The printing press had just been invented. For the first time in history, books could be mass-produced. This meant ideas could spread faster than ever before. And it meant that ordinary people, not just clergy, could access religious texts. This was genuinely revolutionary. For over 1,000 years, only priests could read the Bible. They controlled the interpretation. But now, educated laypeople were starting to read Scripture themselves. And some of them were noticing that what the Church taught didn't always match what the Bible actually said. Enter Martin Luther. He wasn't some radical revolutionary trying to destroy the Church. He was a Catholic friar and theology professor at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. He was deeply pious. He believed in the Church. He taught Catholic theology. But Luther was also a biblical scholar. He spent years studying the Bible, particularly the letters of Paul. And he became convinced that the Church had fundamentally misunderstood Paul's teaching on justification and salvation. Paul's central message, Luther believed, was this: salvation comes through faith alone, not through works, not through paying money, not through the sacraments, not even through the Church's authority. It comes through faith, your personal, direct relationship with God through Christ. This was revolutionary because it cut the Church out of the equation. If salvation came through faith alone, then you didn't need priests. You didn't need indulgences. You didn't need the Church as an intermediary between you and God. In 1517, Luther wrote out his concerns in the form of 95 theses. Think of them as theological debate points, things he wanted to discuss with other scholars. On October 31st, he nailed them to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. This was completely normal academic practice at the time. Church doors were basically the bulletin boards of universities. But something unprecedented happened. Someone translated those Latin theses into German and printed them on the new printing press. Within days, copies were spreading through Germany. Within weeks, they'd been translated into other languages. Within months, they'd reached France, Spain, Italy, and beyond. Luther's academic debate became a continental sensation. The Church didn't respond to this with dialogue. They responded with ultimatums. Luther was given a chance to recant. He refused. In 1521, Pope Leo X excommunicated him. The Holy Roman Emperor placed him under a ban, making it technically illegal to feed or shelter him. But instead of disappearing, Luther became more defiant. He went into hiding in Wartburg Castle and used the time to translate the entire Bible into German so ordinary people could read it themselves. He wrote aggressive pamphlets attacking the Pope. He married a former nun, directly challenging church teachings on celibacy. He was no longer trying to reform the church from within. He was openly breaking from it. And remarkably, he wasn't alone. Other reformers had similar ideas. John Calvin in Geneva developed his own theology of predestination and reform. Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland pushed even further, arguing for a more radical break with church traditions. In England, King Henry VIII broke with Rome for political reasons, and his realm became Protestant. In Scotland, John Knox led the Reformation. In Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands, movements broke away from Rome. By the mid-1500s, roughly half of Western Europe had gone Protestant. France, Spain, Italy, and Poland remained Catholic. Germany was split. The church was shattered. But here's the thing nobody really talks about. Most of the people living through this had no idea what was actually at stake theologically. A peasant in Germany didn't understand the fine theological points about justification by faith. What they knew was that their local priest was now Protestant instead of Catholic, or vice versa. What they knew was that suddenly things that had been sacred, like church decorations, prayers to saints, certain rituals, were now forbidden. What they knew was that their community had been torn apart. And this is where the story gets dark, because what followed wasn't just theological debate. It was violence, widespread, systematic, brutal violence. The first major outbreak was in Germany. From 1524 to 1525, there was the Peasants' War. Religious reformers had promised liberation from oppressive church authority, and many peasants interpreted this as liberation from feudal oppression as well. They revolted. The war was devastating. Estimates suggest 100,000 to 300,000 people died. Luther, who initially sympathized with the peasants, eventually sided with the princes against them. The message was clear. Reform had limits, and those limits were set by whoever held political power. Then came the truly catastrophic wars. In France, there were the Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598. On one side, Catholics. On the other side, French Protestants called Huguenots. The violence escalated to unimaginable levels. The most infamous incident was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when Catholic mobs murdered thousands of Huguenots in Paris and other French cities. Historians estimate between 5,000 and 30,000 people were killed in a few days. Bodies were piled in the streets. Priests blessed the murders. It took decades of warfare before there was any kind of peace. In Germany, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was even worse. What started as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics became a continental war that dragged in virtually every major European power. The scale of destruction was apocalyptic. Entire regions were depopulated. Armies would march through, destroy crops, burn villages, kill civilians. Disease followed. Historians estimate that the 30 Years' War killed between 4 and 8 million people, in a Europe with a total population of maybe 100 million. That's 4 to 8% of Europe's entire population. Entire towns were wiped off the map. In some regions of Germany, up to 1/3 of the population died. When it was finally over in 1648, Europe was exhausted. The Peace of Westphalia established a new principle. The religion of a territory would be determined by the ruler of that territory. Cuius regio, ius religio. Whose realm? His religion. This meant if your prince was Catholic, your territory became Catholic. If he was Protestant, it became Protestant. You didn't get to choose. You got whatever your ruler decided. And if you didn't like it, you had 3 choices: convert, leave, or rebel. Millions of people became religious refugees. Catholics fled Protestant territories. Protestants fled Catholic ones. Communities that had existed for centuries were torn apart. Families were separated. People lost their homes, their livelihoods, everything. And all of this violence was justified theologically on both sides. Catholics believed they were fighting to save souls from heresy. Protestants believed they were fighting for religious freedom and biblical truth. But the actual human cost was incomprehensible. This is the crucial historical context that most people miss. When we talk about Catholics and Protestants not trusting each other, we're not talking about some theoretical theological dispute. We're talking about communities with vivid, recent memories of their neighbors trying to kill them. We're talking about refugee populations. We're talking about intergenerational trauma. In Ireland, the situation was different but equally traumatic. When Ireland was colonized by England, the colonizers were Protestant and the Irish people were Catholic. Catholicism became a marker of Irish identity and resistance to English oppression. Irish Catholics faced systemic discrimination. Their land was confiscated. They were excluded from political power. They couldn't own property in many places. They couldn't attend university. Their priests were hunted. And this wasn't just for a generation or two. This went on for hundreds of years. From the 1600s into the 1900s, Catholics in Ireland were second-class citizens in their own country. So when Irish Catholics immigrated to America in huge numbers in the 1800s, they brought with them not just religious faith, but a deep identity as an oppressed, marginalized group whose faith had been their only source of dignity and community through centuries of persecution. In England itself, after Henry VIII broke with Rome, there were actually killings of both sides. During Mary I's reign, 1553 to 1558, Protestant heretics were burned at the stake, so many that she became known as Bloody Mary. During Elizabeth I's reign, 1558 to 1603, Catholics faced persecution. For centuries, being Catholic in England meant being suspected of disloyalty to the crown, of secretly working for foreign Catholic powers against English interests. This created a situation where religious identity became completely entangled with national identity, political loyalty, and survival. By the 1700s and 1800s, something interesting happened. In many places, the actual theological differences between Catholics and Protestants became less important than the cultural and identity differences. Let me explain what I mean. In theory, Catholicism and Protestantism had different theological views on justification, the authority of the Pope, the role of Mary and saints, the nature of the Eucharist, and various other doctrinal points. These were real differences. But in practice, most ordinary Catholics and Protestants weren't debating theology. They were living in separate communities. They had separate schools. Their children were taught different things. They had different cultural practices around holidays, food, prayer. They married within their own group. They built separate social institutions. In many European cities, Catholics and Protestants literally lived in different neighborhoods. In some cases, there were walls between Catholic and Protestant sections. This happened in places like Buda in Hungary and other Central European cities. In the United States, this was particularly pronounced. When Irish Catholics arrived in the mid-1800s, they faced intense discrimination from the Protestant majority. Signs literally said, "No Irish need apply." They were called subhuman. Protestant Americans genuinely feared that Irish Catholics would create a Catholic theocracy and take over the country. There was deep suspicion that Catholic immigrants couldn't be trusted to be loyal Americans because their ultimate loyalty was to the Pope in Rome, a foreign power. So Irish Catholics built their own institutions. They created their own schools. They built hospitals. They created benevolent societies and mutual aid organizations. They developed their own neighborhoods. By doing this, they created a parallel Catholic subculture within American society. This wasn't just about religion. It was about survival. When you're facing discrimination, creating your own institutions means you can control what happens to your own community. It means your children get educated. It means you have access to health care. It means you have a social safety net when times get hard. But it also meant that Irish Catholics became a distinct cultural group, not just a religious group. Being Irish Catholic became an identity that included political affiliation, social networks, cultural practices, and residential location, not just theological beliefs. Similar patterns played out with Italian Catholics, Polish Catholics, and other immigrant groups. And this created a situation where Catholic and Protestant became stand-ins for larger cultural and ethnic divisions. When Italian Protestants didn't exist in significant numbers in America, but Italian Catholics did, Catholicism became associated with Italian identity. When most African Americans became Protestant rather than Catholic, being Protestant became associated with African American identity and black churches. In Northern Ireland, Catholicism and Protestantism became proxies for Irish identity versus British identity. The conflict in Northern Ireland for the past 100+ years has been marketed as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it was really about Irish independence versus British colonial rule. Religion was the identity marker that separated the two sides, but the actual conflict was political and national. This is a crucial distinction. The Catholic-Protestant divide started as theological disagreement. It became a war-based trauma, and then it solidified into cultural and ethnic identity divisions that had increasingly little to do with actual theology. By the 1900s, in most places, ordinary Catholics and Protestants weren't divided by theology. They were divided by where their grandparents came from, what language they spoke, what neighborhoods they lived in, what schools they attended, and what cultural practices they maintained. A working-class Catholic in Boston in 1920 probably didn't spend a lot of time thinking about transubstantiation or papal authority. What he thought about was that he was Irish, that his community had been discriminated against, that his church and social organizations had been his lifeline, and that Protestants had been the source of that discrimination. Similarly, a Protestant in Northern Ireland probably didn't spend much time debating predestination or the priesthood of all believers. What he thought about was that he was British, that his community had been there for generations, that Protestants had historically held power, and that Catholics were trying to take that away. The theological divide had become a cultural divide, which had become a political and national divide. And because it had become those things, it was much harder to overcome. Theology can be debated and agreed upon, but identity, culture, and national allegiance, those run much deeper. They're connected to your sense of who you are, where you belong, and what community you're part of. The theological stuff, that actually doesn't matter much anymore. Now, I should spend some time on the actual theological differences because people always ask, but I want to be honest, most regular Catholics and Protestants couldn't articulate these differences even if they tried. And most younger Catholics and Protestants today don't really care about them. But let me lay out the major ones anyway, because understanding them is important context. First, authority. Catholics believe that the Church has authority that comes from Jesus through the apostles and continues through the popes and bishops. This authority is preserved in both Scripture and sacred tradition, the accumulated teachings of the Church. Protestants believe in sola scriptura, Scripture alone. Only the Bible is authoritative for doctrine. Tradition might be helpful and historically important, but it's not binding. This is a genuinely important theological difference, but in practice it matters less than you'd think. Most modern Catholics read the Bible and think for themselves about theology. Most modern Protestants listen to their pastors and accept certain teachings based on tradition. So the practical divide is smaller than the theoretical one. Second, Mary and the saints. Catholics believe that Mary, Jesus' mother, was sinless and remained a virgin her whole life. They pray to Mary and ask her to intercede for them with Jesus. They believe saints are worthy of veneration and can intercede on our behalf. This is called veneration, not worship. Catholics make a distinction between worshiping God and venerating saints. Protestants think this is idolatry. They believe Jesus is the only mediator between God and humans. Praying to Mary or saints is, in their view, treating them like gods. Protestants generally don't venerate Mary beyond acknowledging her historical importance as the mother of Jesus. Again, this is a real theological divide. But most modern Catholics aren't actually that focused on saint veneration in their daily faith lives. And most modern Protestants don't have strong feelings about Mary one way or another. Third, the Eucharist or communion. Catholics believe in transubstantiation, the doctrine that during the Mass, the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ. This isn't symbolic. It's an actual metaphysical transformation. When you consume the Eucharist in a Catholic Mass, you're consuming the actual body and blood of Christ, even though it still looks and tastes like bread and wine. Most Protestants believe the bread and wine are symbolic. They represent the body and blood of Christ, but they don't literally become it. Some Protestant traditions have nuanced views in between these two positions. This is a significant theological difference with practical implications for how the two faiths practice their most important ritual. But again, most modern people, both Catholic and Protestant, don't think deeply about the metaphysics of what's happening during communion. They just do it. Fourth, the priesthood. The Catholic Church has a distinct priestly class. Priests are ordained through a sacrament. They have special authority. Only priests can hear confessions and grant absolution for sins. Only priests can perform certain sacraments. Protestants believe in the priesthood of all believers. Every Christian is a priest. You don't need an ordained clergyman to mediate between you and God. You can confess your sins directly to God. You don't need absolution from a priest. God's forgiveness is available to you directly through faith. This is a major structural difference between the two religions, but in practice, most Protestant churches still have pastors and church hierarchies. And many Protestants actually want pastoral guidance and authority. So the practical difference is smaller than the theory suggests. Fifth, salvation and grace. This gets into the theological disputes that started with Luther. Luther believed salvation comes through faith alone, through your personal trust in Jesus, not through works. The Catholic teaching is more nuanced. Salvation comes through grace, which is made available through the sacraments of the Church, and your faith and works together cooperate with that grace. In modern times, a lot of this theological difference has been reconciled or at least acknowledged as not as important as it once seemed. In 1999, the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation issued a joint declaration on justification saying that their views weren't as far apart as they thought. But the bigger point is this: for most modern Catholics and Protestants, these theological differences are abstractions. They don't really affect how they practice their faith day to day. They're often not even aware of what their own church's official position is on these questions. What's actually happened is that theology has become less important to religious identity than other factors: social networks, culture, personal experience, values alignment, and community. A progressive Catholic might agree more with a progressive Protestant on issues like social justice, LGBTQ+ inclusion, and environmental responsibility than with a traditionalist Catholic. And vice versa. In fact, in modern times, the divide within Catholicism between progressive and conservative is often bigger than the divide between progressive Catholics and progressive Protestants. The modern healing and where it's incomplete. So where are we today? Has the Catholic-Protestant divide healed? The answer is, in many places, yes. In others, it's more complicated. In the United States, the Catholic-Protestant divide is largely healed among ordinary people. Interfaith marriages between Catholics and Protestants are completely normal. Nobody raises an eyebrow. Kids grow up with one Catholic parent and one Protestant parent and think nothing of it. Catholics and Protestants work together, go to school together, run businesses together, serve in the military together. They vote for candidates from other faiths without hesitation. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 was a massive deal specifically because he was Catholic. There was real anxiety among Protestant voters that a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope. But that seems almost absurd now. Today, the religious affiliation of a candidate matters far less than their political positions. And if someone's worried about a candidate being influenced by their religion, it's more likely to be about whether they're too religious in general, not specifically about whether they're Catholic. In parts of Western Europe, particularly Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, Catholics and Protestants have largely reconciled. They work together in ecumenical projects. They acknowledge the historical trauma. They've genuinely moved forward. In some of these countries, Intermarriage is so common that religious affiliation barely registers as a significant identity factor. Even the Vatican and major Protestant denominations have issued formal statements acknowledging their shared history and their desire for unity. Pope Francis has been particularly progressive about this. He's met with Protestant leaders, acknowledged historical wrongs, promoted dialogue, and generally pushed for reconciliation rather than defending ancient divisions. But, and this is important, the healing is not evenly distributed globally, and in some places new tensions have emerged. In Northern Ireland, while peace has been achieved, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 ended most of the violence. Catholics and Protestants still largely live in separate communities. There are still predominantly Catholic neighborhoods and predominantly Protestant neighborhoods. There are still some tensions, though they're generally much lower than they were during the worst of the Troubles. In some Latin American countries, rapid Protestant evangelical growth has created new tensions with the dominant Catholic Church. There's resentment in some Catholic circles about evangelical missionaries coming in and converting people away from Catholicism. In some cases, there's actual violence between Catholic and evangelical communities. In parts of Africa and Asia, as Christianity grows, the Catholic-Protestant divide is actually being imported and recreated in places where it had no historical presence. In Nigeria, for example, religious conflict has become entangled with political conflict in ways that echo historical Catholic-Protestant tensions, even though the local history is different. And in America, while the old Catholic-Protestant divide among ordinary people has largely healed, a new kind of religious divide has emerged. It's less about Catholics versus Protestants and more about traditionalist Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, versus progressive Christianity versus secular society. So in some ways, the original Catholic-Protestant divide has been overcome. But in other ways, it's been replaced by new religious divisions that echo the same pattern. Identity, politics, power, and culture wrapped up in religious markers. So here's the big takeaway. The Catholic-Protestant divide teaches us something crucial about how religious conflict actually works in the real world. Religious conflict is rarely actually about religion. It's about identity, power, belonging, and trauma. The theological disputes between Catholics and Protestants were real, but they would never have created centuries of violence and division if they hadn't been tied to questions of political power, national identity, and cultural survival. This is relevant today because we see the same pattern playing out in other religious conflicts around the world. We see it in Islam with Sunni-Shia divisions. We see it in Judaism with Orthodox Reform Conservative divisions. We see it in Buddhism, Hinduism, and every other major religion. And we see it in secular ideological conflicts too. The pattern is the same. When we understand that religious conflict is usually about power and identity more than theology, we can be smarter about it. We can recognize when we're being manipulated by tribal identity markers. We can choose to build bridges instead of walls. And we can learn from how Catholics and Protestants, at least in many places, have managed to move beyond centuries of hatred, trauma, and suspicion. The other reason this matters is hope. If the most bitter religious divide in the history of Western civilization can heal, that tells us something important. Division isn't permanent. Trauma can be overcome. Communities can reconcile. It's not easy. It takes time. It requires honesty about history and genuine willingness to move forward. But it's possible. Thanks for watching. If you found this valuable, please subscribe to Christian Faith Archive for more deep dives into the history, culture, and beliefs that shape our world.